Alright, so this video is going to cover the second half of lesson 15 on trade. So in the previous video, we identified a few key concepts and used our simple model of trade, two countries, two goods, and we identified who had the absolute advantage, who had the comparative advantage, and then talked about, the terms of trade. And then we finally wrapped up with, the benefits of trade, and then some other practical considerations. So now what we want to do is kind of look at it from the opposite perspective and think, well, why might certain groups of people within a country not be so thrilled about higher levels of trade? So what are some arguments that people make against trade or in favor of restricting trade? Because again, there are going to be benefits, definitely in the long run when countries begin to trade with one another. But initially, those benefits might not be distributed evenly throughout society, or there may be certain groups or sectors within the society or the economy that are actually going to take a hit as a result of opening up to trade and higher levels of trade. So long run, everyone will benefit, but in the short run, there may be some arguments to be made for holding off on trade. So I've got them listed on the study guide, so we're just going to work through these one by one. The first argument is what's known as the infant industry argument. So in some cases, there may be a country that doesn't have, for example, a domestic car maker, right? So in America, we have Ford and Chevy. In Germany, they've got BMW and Mercedes, and in Japan and Korea, they have, a lot of well-known car companies. But, there may be other countries out there that have absolutely no car industry, no auto industry. And there may be people in that country that say, you know what? We have some resources that we could use to make, a car. Why don't we give it a shot? All right. So they're going to start a brand new car company. Now the problem is, if their country is engaged with trade with other countries, there's going to be all of these American and German and Korean and Japanese cars that are already going to be imported into the country. And so the domestic car maker, right? They may have a great car, great idea, great plan, but it's going to be really hard for them to compete initially with all of these, big foreign automakers. And so what they might do is they might say to their government, say, hey, we would like to develop a domestic auto industry, but we can't compete with the foreign competition. So would you please, restrict trade? Would you maybe put a limit on how many foreign cars can be imported, or tax them, or something? We'll get to those tools in just a second, but do something so that we have a chance to develop our domestic auto industry and to actually grow it, to become an adult, right, or a big boy, and then you can compete with all of these foreign companies. So that's one reason why we might see trade restrictions, is to give domestic companies a chance to get started and grow. The second argument we heard is the anti-dumping argument. And dumping refers to a company in some other country that has produced so much of its product, it has a bunch of leftover, that has excess, and it's already sold as much as it can domestically, and it just wants to get rid of them. And so it may put them on a boat or a plane and send them to some other country and just dump them there. Not like in the garbage dump, but they're going to dump them in that foreign market and perhaps sell them for just dirt cheap, rock bottom prices. In some cases, a company may have made so much money back home selling to its domestic customers that it could afford to sell those dumped items at a loss per unit because they've already made so much money back home. Example of this several years ago was Chinese tire companies were producing a lot of tires and selling them to Chinese car makers and Chinese drivers. But at the end of the day, they had a bunch of leftover tires, and so they started dumping them in foreign markets. Well, you can imagine in the United States, companies like Goodyear or Firestone aren't going to be too thrilled about that because they certainly aren't going to be able to compete with those rock bottom prices, especially if the foreign companies selling those tires, at a loss per tire, a loss per unit. And so that's another argument that we can make against trade, to say, hey, we're all about trade, but we're going to, say no to dumping it. If we feel like a company in a foreign country is dumping their excess products here, then we'll cut that off. Now, the third argument, this is the one that probably hits much more closer to home for a lot of people, and it's this idea that one comparative advantage that we see countries experiencing is the fact that their workers are willing to work for just much lower wages than American workers or European workers. And so what we're going to see is that as jobs start being offshored or outsourced to places where the wages are lower, where the labor is cheaper, that means domestically in our country, that means we're going to be losing jobs. Unemployment is going to start to go up, which is going to lead to overall decrease in income. And so, in an effort to protect our income and just protect American jobs, we may limit or discourage trade with countries where they have much cheaper supply of labor. And so that's always a hot topic. Anytime we open up to trade is because the question is, well, if there's another country that specializes better in something, what's going to happen to our domestic industry? Well, it may go out of business, it may scale back, which means jobs and income are going to be at risk. So that's a third argument we hear. We got to protect jobs and income and wages. And then finally, there's this national defense argument, and this it's not just national defense in terms of bombs and rockets and tanks and airplanes, things like that. It's goods and services in general. The way to think about it is, imagine you're a country that relies on another country for certain goods and services. Well, what happens if that country experiences a disaster, or that country gets attacked, or they go to war? Or what happens if something disrupts the flow of the goods and services, right? Maybe you rely on these goods from this other country, and they have to put them on a ship, and then suddenly there's pirates or something. Well, what happens? You were relying on them to produce and sell you these goods and services, which means now you're going to have to do without. Now, in some cases, that might not be such a big deal, depending on the goods and the services. But in some cases, what if it is, military material that we're importing from other country? Well, now, if something has disrupted the trade, we have nothing to literally defend ourselves with. And so that may be an argument to say, okay, well, we're going to buy some more of that material from foreigners, but we also need to make sure that we're producing some of it at home. So to some extent, we need to discourage or restrict that trade a little bit. But again, it's not just the bombs and planes and rockets and tanks. What about basic necessities like clothing or food or medical supplies? Well, if you were relying on imports, if you're relying on other countries to produce and sell these things to you, and then something disrupts the trade, suddenly, forget defending yourself. You can't even feed yourself, provide medical attention, things like that. And so to provide for the country, but then also to defend the country, we may restrict trade, limit trade in certain industries to make sure that we can produce some of it at home should anything bad happen. So those are four kind of traditional economic arguments that we see being made against trade. And again, there are clear benefits to trade, but those benefits might not be experienced, broadly or widely in society, and so some people may make an argument against the trade. Now, there's another thing we have to think about, and I refer to these as kind of concerns about increased levels of trade or globalization. Again, clear benefits to trade, but there's some other things we have to keep in mind as we are trading with other countries. In particular, countries that are lagging behind in terms of economic growth or standard of living. So the United States, Western Europe, other parts of the world, we have a high standard of living, we have large economies, high levels of income, and obviously people in countries that aren't as developed are, they would like to achieve the same standard of living, the same level of income that we would in the United States and other countries. And so sometimes what we see happening is that when countries realize they have some comparative advantage and they realize, hey, we can start producing goods and services, and start trading with other countries to start, consuming more and raising our standard of living. Sometimes they may recognize that, but then they may rush to take advantage. And so sometimes, when people rush to grow their economies, there are things that, kind of go by the wayside or get ignored or overlooked. And two in particular are environmental quality and working conditions. And so what we see sometimes in lesser developed countries is that in their rush to grow, they may not pay much attention to the impact of their industries on the environment. And so they may be running factories that create a lot of air pollution, or businesses may be dumping stuff into fields, and that destroys the vegetation, or maybe it leaks into the water supply. These are big concerns. In this country, we have clear rules and laws and regulations about damaging the environment. We can produce the things we need, but as long as we don't cause irreparable harm to the environment. In other countries, again, they're just trying to grow as quickly as they can. They don't necessarily have these laws and rules, and so there's going to be catastrophes that could have been avoided, but were not simply. The other thing is working conditions. So again, these poor, lesser developed countries, they just want to grow as quickly as they can. And another thing that gets ignored sometimes are the working conditions. And so, country like Bangladesh, for an example, large population. It's a big supply of labor and relatively cheap labor compared to the United States and Europe. Well, there were some people there that said, "Hey, we've got a building. We've got all these people that are willing to work." So they brought in equipment from other countries, United States, Europe, and they hired all the workers, and they went in, and every day they'd all go into this building, this big factory, and make clothing, garments, and then they would export them back to countries like U.S. and other parts of Europe. So it's good news for everyone, right? We're getting cheaper garments, they're getting jobs, they're going to grow their economy, until one day everybody comes in and the building just collapsed, and it killed a lot of people. Okay, obviously, people should not have been working in that building, right? In the United States, we have, again, just like with environmental rules, that we have working condition rules. You can't force people to work in a building that's not structurally sound. Or a great example from 100 years ago in the United States. Not to say that we've always been perfect. We're still not perfect, but I mean, you don't typically go to work worrying about whether the building's going to collapse on you. At least not today. Flashback 100 years ago, you may recall from your U.S. history classes an incident known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Real famous catastrophe. There were a lot of women, again, cheap supply of labor at the time, that were working in a building, making whatever triangle shirtwaists are. But again, a lot of people, a lot of equipment, a lot of particulate dust in the air because they're working with cotton and thread and materials, and so fluff gets all up in the air, and suddenly something sparked, and it created a fire. Well, normally, today when there's a fire, we simply go to the fire exit, the emergency exit. Fortunately, in that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the owners, the managers, had locked all the doors, and so the women, they couldn't get out, and they either burned to death or some of them leapt to their death from the window. Well, why were the doors locked? Well, the managers wanted to make sure the women weren't sneaking out, and wanted to make sure they were actually in there doing their job. Well, clearly you can't lock the fire safety doors in this country today, right? So what's happened in the meantime? Why is it that we have environmental rules, working condition rules, whereas other countries don't? And if you think about it, it's almost a luxury to be concerned about things like the environment or working conditions. And it's a luxury in that countries that are poor, that are trying to grow, they're focused on that growth, right? They're worried about putting food on the table. Right, whereas the average American has a much higher standard of living, isn't as stressed as someone working in a poorer country about where the food's going to come from, if they're going to have a roof over their heads or clothes that aren't in tatters. And so this idea of concern about things other than just our immediate well-being, we have the time, we have the luxury of time to think about these things. And not only that, but we have the resources as a society to actually do something about it, right? We have environmental protection, and we have working, labor laws like no child labor, no sweatshops, things like that. Well, it takes resources. It literally takes time and money for a society to first create these laws and then enforce them to make sure that we don't damage the environment or force people to work in unsafe conditions. So, unfortunately, these things still happen. The good news is that as we continue to grow our economy and other economies, other societies continue to grow, hopefully, once their standard of living is raised enough, they then are going to have the time and the resources necessary to then address these concerns. So it may not be happening here, but obviously, it's a globalized economy. We're all in this together around the entire world, and so, it's the only planet we've got at the end of the day, right? And so we may take time to, think about these concerns. And if these, are enough of a concern, if we see, companies and people damaging the environment or hurting workers in other countries, then we may restrict the trade. We may say, hey, no, you cannot sell your goods here unless you prove to us that you didn't chop down the rainforest or dump chemicals in the river or employ child or slave labor. Okay, so we can put rules and restrictions there's rules and restrictions about what we do here in our country, but then we can also apply those same rules to the goods that we import. Now, if we buy into any of these arguments, if we feel that the people making the arguments are justified, what can we do about it? And the two basic tools we have are a tariff and an import quota. So a tariff, we've mentioned that before when we've talked about taxes. And so this is just simply a tax on imports. And what this is going to do is it's going to raise the price of the foreign goods and services. Well, one reason we were probably buying the foreign goods and services in the first place is because they were cheaper. So by putting a tax onto those goods and services, it raises the price, and in some cases it may even make those foreign goods and services more expensive than domestic goods and services. And so what we see as a result of the tariff is that we will buy fewer imports, or maybe we'll just stop buying the imports if the tax is too high, and instead we'll shift over and start consuming goods that are made domestically. So, how is this going to affect different groups of people? Well, clearly, the domestic producers and the domestic workers are going to be, made a little bit better off because they're not facing as much competition from the imports. On the other hand, those foreign producers and workers, they're going to be selling less to us, so they may be, seeing a hit in their business and maybe having to lay off some workers. What about consumers? Well, in the domestic country, we're going to be either paying higher prices for the domestic goods and services or paying higher prices for fewer of the foreign goods and services. So either way you look at it, we're paying higher prices and getting less of that good or service. And then finally, with a tariff, there's one more entity that we need to consider, and that's the entity that is imposing the tariff. In other words, the government. So a tariff is a tax, which means when a government imposes a tariff, that's going to generate tax revenue for the government. So this will actually, it's not going to solve a budget deficit, but, a little bit of extra tax revenue isn't going to hurt the government. Now, we contrast that with an import quota. And a quota is just a limit, so it could be either a minimum or maximum. And in this case, an import quota is going to be a maximum number of the imported good that can be actually imported. So what this is going to do is it's basically going to have the same effect as the tariff. It's just now, instead of targeting the price, we're targeting the quantity. And so by restricting the quantity of the imports that are allowed, it's effectively going to raise their price, because whenever the supply of something decreases, right, the price, its value goes up. So we may still be importing the foreign goods and services, just not as many, and then that may cause some upward pressure on the prices. And then of course some domestic consumers will switch back over to domestic goods that may have been higher priced. So how does this affect the different groups? Well, in terms of the domestic producers and workers, the foreign producers and workers, and the domestic consumers, it's the same effect as a tariff. The only real difference is that under an import quota, clearly the government is not going to be collecting any tax revenue because there's no tax as there is under a tariff. So for that reason, you might expect that when governments around the world are trying to decide how to restrict imports, if they're choosing between a tariff and a quota, they're more than likely probably going to choose the tariff, because then at the end of the day, the government at least gets some tax revenue. And then, as I mentioned before, with those ethical concerns, another way we can restrict trade without a tariff or a quota is to impose rules and restrictions. And so these may be product safety rules, which says you can sell your goods here as long as they don't make people sick or hurt people. There may be worker safety, saying, okay, you can sell your goods here as long as you can prove to us that you're protecting your workers. And then, of course, there may be environmental safety. Okay, you can sell your coffee here as long as you prove you didn't, clear cut a rainforest to grow the coffee, so things like that. So, no, not a tax, not a limit on the quantity, just something about how it's made or how it's consumed. And if you're a foreign company and you can't satisfy those rules and regulations, then that's it. You're cut out. You cannot sell your goods and services here. So that wraps up lesson 15. Again, in part 1, we looked at our model, the economic justification for trade, and talked about the benefits and practical considerations. And now in the second video, we've looked at it from a different perspective to think about, what are some arguments we make against trade, what are some other concerns about increased levels of trade, globalization, and then finally, what can we do to try and restrict trade with the use of a tariff or a quota or rules and regulations.